America's Cold War, Chapter 1, The Demise of Free Security, Part 3. Roosevelt needed the time because he faced formidable political obstacles to any move to bring the United States into the war on the side of Britain. Foremost among them was the legacy of Wilson's intervention in World War I. Many in Middle America and in Congress were so determined to avoid being hoodwinked a second time that they dismissed an overly alarmist Roosevelt's frequent claims of threats to American civilization. "There he goes," they said, "crying wolf again." Beard and many other anti-war liberals hammered this theme home, their message driving much of the liberal political discourse in the United States during 39 and 40. Furthermore, many Americans of German or Italian descent opposed a war against those two countries, and many Irish Americans loathed the prospect of siding with Britain. Italian and Irish Americans wielded significant clout in the Democratic Party, as did other liberal anti-war groups. Finally, Roosevelt struggled to articulate effectively why he believed U.S. intervention might be necessary. Time and again, he emphasized that the oceans could no longer protect America, that Germany could project its power into the Western Hemisphere, and that the United States faced the danger of isolation in a tyrannical world. The American people, he declared in a typical speech, could not draw a line of defense around this country and live completely and solely to ourselves. He refused before the November election to suggest that this would eventually require American entry into the war. Rather, during the grim spring and summers of 1940, he stressed America's obligation to serve as the arsenal of democracy, to provide the U.S. wealth, but not American blood, to the enemies of fascism. Following his re-election, Roosevelt moved more decisively toward intervention, and by the middle of 1941, he was working actively to insinuate the United States into the war. In December 1940, he announced his proposal to lend Great Britain a vast amount of war material, knowing full well that this would tie American fortunes much more tightly with those of the British, and then, after June 1941, the USSR, a reality not lost on the opponents of his Lend-Lease program. In the spring of 1941, he authorized the use of American convoys to protect U.S. and British ships, delivering this material to the United Kingdom, again, fully aware that it would likely lead to hostilities in the Atlantic between the United States Navy and German U-boats, which were sinking transatlantic ships almost on a daily basis. That summer, after Japanese troops occupied French Indochina, the U.S. government placed an embargo on strategic exports to Japan, including oil. FDR had earlier resisted embargoing oil because he feared, rightly, that the Tokyo officials would consider a cutoff to be a life-and-death matter. "The oil gauge and the clock stood side by side," wrote one observer. Perhaps more important, in August 1941, Roosevelt met with British Prime Minister Winston Churchill for 4 days off the coast of Newfoundland. They got on well, swapping stories and enjoying the fact that Churchill's mother hailed from New York. The two leaders issued the Atlantic Charter, an Anglo-American declaration of war aims that bore the hallmarks of Wilsonianism: self-determination, collective security, disarmament, economic cooperation, and freedom of the seas. But the post-war order they envisioned at the moment would be run by the United States and Great Britain, not by a genuinely international body. Churchill, to downplay the commitments to self-determination and absolute free trade, suggested that due attention be paid to existing obligations. The significance of the meeting and the Charter for American Foreign Policy, however, was undeniable. The Anglo-American partnership emerged stronger than ever, and U.S. intervention in the war more likely. The Charter laid out a post-war plan that fit American objectives and played to Americans' idealistic sentiments. No longer did the President speak of the United States acting merely as an arsenal of democracy. He seemed to be making it his business to overcome domestic opposition and get America into action. And indeed, upon his return to London, the Prime Minister told aides that FDR had promised to wage war against Germany and do everything to look for an incident which would justify him in opening hostilities. Within days, German and American ships came into direct contact in the Atlantic. On September 4th, a German submarine launched torpedoes at, but missed, the American destroyer Greer. Henceforth, Roosevelt said, the U.S. Navy would shoot on sight. He also announced a policy he already had promised Churchill in private. American warships would convoy British merchant ships across the ocean. Thus, the United States entered into an undeclared naval war with Germany. In October, when the destroyer Reuben James went down with the loss of more than 100 American lives, Congress scrapped the cash and carry policy and further revised the Neutrality Act to permit transport of munitions to Britain on armed American merchant ships. In light of the rising tension in the Atlantic, it is ironic that America's formal entry into the Second World War came by way of Asia. Relations with Japan plummeted further in the fall, as leaders in Tokyo rejected U.S. demands to respect China's sovereignty and territorial integrity. In short, to get out of China. Japanese-American talks continued in November, but went nowhere. Suffering under the embargo and certain that war with the United States had become inevitable, the Japanese High Command authorized a daring raid on America's Pacific Fleet, moored at Pearl Harbor, on the Hawaiian island of Oahu, near Honolulu. The Japanese struck on the morning of December 7th, damaging most of the fleet's battleships and killing or wounding more than 3,000 servicemen. Roosevelt asked Congress to declare war on Japan, which it did, the determined isolation of many of its members melting away. Japan's major allies, Italy and Germany, responded by declaring war on the United States 4 days later. Charles Beard's great fear had been realized. America was once again at war.